whatever inner work you have not paid attention to or is undone will show up in your work in community, because that's going to present itself for healing in some capacity in your life. And when you feel like you have worked on it, it's going to show up again to present itself for mastery.
3, 2, 1. Welcome to the Campfire Circle. I'm your host, Tanya Bhattacharya, and I empower purpose-driven women in building influential personal brands that drive change and raise revenue. We all talk about getting a seat at the table, but why though? Who wants to sit in a stuffy boardroom anyway? Let's reimagine the ultimate space of leadership as a campfire circle, where we share stories that inspire movements, build brave communities to huddle together with for warmth, and where there is always room. Come sit with us.
I am so excited to have multipreneur Aila Malik with us today on the podcast. Aila does so much that this introduction is probably not going to encapsulate her full essence, but all we can do is our best. So Aila is a lawyer by schooling and a nonprofit executive by trade who's based up in the Bay Area. She started a management consulting firm, Venture Leadership Consulting, that partners with nonprofits to close systemic gaps of inequity. 3 years after founding that firm, she, her husband, and 3 children traveled the globe together, and during that time visited over 40 countries and partnered with 25 NGOs to preserve cultural and natural wisdom. At some point during that journey, she also became a children's book author, amazing chef, per her Instagram stories, and many other things too. But everything that she does is bound together by community kindness, planet protection, and family togetherness. Wow. Aila, welcome to the Campfire Circle.
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you. I'm excited to be here. I feel the warmth of the campfire, the proverbial campfire.
Yes, that is the goal. I feel the warmth too. Aila, I would love for you to tell me your story. How did you become the activist, the social justice warrior, the planet protector, the world explorer that you are today? What's your story?
Oh my gosh, where do I start, Tanya? Let's see. Story is childhood was filled with a lot of love. I'm a South Asian immigrant, first generation American, but born and raised here, but from parents who came from Pakistan in the 70s. And were met with a lot of challenges as they were successful in their own right. But at the center of all that they were doing, they did their very best to raise me, which I am so grateful for. So I'm a product of a lot of love and a lot of challenge, and found myself, there was always the mantra to work. So at age 14, got my first job, and, when I could get my worker's permit at high school, and found myself always just leaning into whatever experience was in front of me. And this term of multipreneurship is a new one to me. It used to be called scattered and distracted and, unable to focus on one thing. And so fast forward, went to UC Santa Barbara undeclared as a major. Again, wanted to figure out what it was that I was going to do. And there, again, working in communities where I worked was never a question. It was always to have a job and to work. And so when I look back later, this whole notion of multipreneur and being able to be rooted in community and finding jobs that were around building community was a theme that emerged well later. It was not present to me during those moments. And there's a really interesting story for me that I recently became present to, which was that I ended up becoming an environmental studies major in Santa Barbara. And at the time, there was a lot of activism on campus against oil rigging, and there were people living in trees as a form of civil disobedience. And I didn't see myself as an activist. That title was reserved for those people who looked a certain way at the time, like didn't shave their legs, lived in trees, like chained themselves to things, right? Like that wasn't something that I saw myself in. And I thought for many years that I was anything but an activist. So every single moment and at every single turn, I was drawn to people who were standing up for something. And they were standing up for a better world in whatever shape that looked like, whether that was through a hearing, whether that was through visiting someone who was incarcerated, whether that was through being in a substance abuse or a mental hospital and doing navigation that way. And it wasn't actually until the ending of my story where I started to try to weave together the various paths and the various experiences to make it mean something that I realized that activism to me looked like a deep intention and a desire for a better planet, and using all my dimensions to move that way, whether that's through parenting and being intentional in my parenting, whether that's through building companies that are for, elevating the nonprofit sector, whether that was through community building, through volunteerism, and through my own advocacy within my community. So figuring out what that looked like brought me to a place in my journey where I'm able to incorporate all of those things with a lot of pride. That's probably a very scattered story, multipreneuristic story, but that's what it is.
I love the concept of multipreneur. One of the first podcast episodes I did was with the woman, Dr. Sarah Beth Burke, who talked about being a hybrid professional, which is reminiscent of this. It's like taking all of the different pieces of expertise into a mosaic and turning that into this like identity of like, you may be the only person in the world who is a multipreneur in these facets and these ways, but that is what part of what makes you so, I can't think of the word, like desirable comes to mind, but like so powerful in what you do, because you have so many different skill sets and life experiences that have culminated in now these different activations. And I want to actually ask you a little bit more about some of those life experiences. Sure. From what you've shared with me, and then also a little bit of what I know about you personally. You and I share an identity of being children of South Asian immigrants. My parents are from Bangladesh. They moved here in the 70s. And there's this kind of funny thing that happens where there's like a real emphasis and generational drive towards education and quote unquote success, but not necessarily maybe having the lived experience within these systems to like guide that and back that up. There's this kind of core memory that reverberates around my head, which is like when I was a kid in elementary school, we didn't necessarily know like what school supplies we needed to have. And so I didn't have a glue stick. And so being the ever resourceful, like immigrants we were, like we would use white rice instead of a glue stick. And that's how I would make my like little projects. And then take that and it gets exponentified when you're talking about like FAFSA or like college applications, stuff like that. And then going into the nonprofit field, as you have, it kind of reminded me of that. Like we have so many big problems to solve, but we're like homegrown. Like nonprofit leaders don't always have like this technical training or experience or, do you feel like that piece kind of impacted what you do now in your work?
Oh my gosh, 100%. I so resonate. It's interesting too. And I'll share that I've been having a lot of these moments of the immigrant story, even if you're born here, is one of resourcefulness and resilience. Yep. It's not resilience necessarily by desire. It's resilience of necessity, right? And so the asset of that is being able to use white rice for glue sticks, or being able to, or being able to find the resources that you need to navigate that moment. And the shadow side of that is when you get older, you realize that you did great and you're missing a lot of things that would have been great if there had been some proactive support in that area, right? So for me, now as a mom, navigating, my oldest is just finished his sophomore year in high school. And we're now starting to look at colleges and does he take the ACT or SAT? And, do we do college tours? I don't think I had any of that. And not because, education was a huge priority and a huge value. No one knew how to navigate it, right? No one knew that you're supposed to have college advisors and essay support writers and right. I mean, it was sort of a free for all. And I remember, a little bit tangential to your nonprofit question, but I remember applying to an Ivy League school because a friend of mine did. And I got an interview. Maybe everybody does. I don't even know. And I did not prepare for it. I showed up at an alumni interview house and they asked me why I wanted to go to that school. And I said, well, it's great for liberal arts. I mean, I had no concept, no clue. And of course I didn't make it in, I'm sure for various reasons. But I had that moment later, years later, when I came full circle in the nonprofit entrepreneurial space and realized that initially many founders of social enterprises start with a network base of wealth to help seed those ideas. And many folks who didn't have that kind of curated approach to systems find themselves in a place where they're proud of how far they've come and the mileage they've walked. And they see what could have been had there been more intention around that network or around that type of system entry. And so I see it with my own kids, and it's really cool to be in a position of trying to now navigate what are the resources to give my now privileged kid that probably does not know how privileged he is, right? So I think in the nonprofit sector, you're totally right. A lot of us are homegrown and self-taught. The old guard of founders and CEOs come from a network that is really well funded and resourced, maybe not necessarily in business, or maybe the person doesn't have the business or the technical acumen, but they sure as heck have the network. And now that we're looking at a movement of BIPOC-led organizations, folks that are coming up with diversity at the top, means that many of us don't have access to those networks built in from our childhood or our adolescence, and we have to tap into those now. And those networks are largely, again, old guard networks are largely those of white folks of a lot of wealth and a lot of generational privilege. And so it's been an interesting space to be a nonprofit leader for sure.
Oh, that's the understatement of the
True.
It has been interesting. And there's another kind of angle I want to attack this at in terms of, the work that you do, which is really systemic change management with nonprofits, which is an experience that I know you and I also share, which is that piece around, how do I want to say this? This piece around, mental health, addiction, substance use disorder, and growing up as a parentified child. Mm-hmm. And, I want to just kind of lead into this by saying I think addiction is hugely misunderstood and severely underplayed. I never personally had that allergy to drugs and alcohol that so many do, but the behaviors that show up for me are overwork, perfectionism, codependency. And I think so many of us who flock to social impact work and nonprofit work had something happen to us either in our childhood or in our lineage that caused us to have this parentification, this like savior, this martyrdom energy, if you will. And then when we go into the workplace, we bring on those same roles from that family of origin. And do you also see this like saviorism piece happening in the nonprofit industry? Is this a big thing?
100%, 100%. I don't even know that this is just the nonprofit industry. It's just more prevalent because you work with humans. We learn about ourselves through others, right? In community and you don't learn about yourself sitting in a box. You learn about yourself and how the interactions are, what irks you, what triggers you, what brings you joy, what brings you peace. And so much of, I really believe, and I used to say this all the time when I would hire volunteers, whatever inner work you have not paid attention to or is undone will show up in your work in community, because that's going to present itself for healing in some capacity in your life. And when you feel like you have worked on it, it's going to show up again to present itself for mastery, right? A double check is my belief. And so because the nonprofit community is one in which we are working with people in community, in our staff teams and our board teams, and then out with other people largely, that inner work shows up and presents itself in various forms again and again. And I think coupled with the inner work that presents, a lot of us in the sector have a very difficult and complicated relationship with conflict. And that I talk about that a lot because it is the one through thread that I see in most difficult leadership structures, is that somewhere in there, the leader is uncomfortable with conflict. And they have not yet transformed conflict as a way to deepen relationship. They see it either as somewhere in their childhood experience as destructive or as something that was irreparable or caused a lot of pain. And so people either railroad through decisions or railroad through meetings, or they become avoidant or somewhere in the middle. And I think I've spent a lot of years trying to reorient and pay attention to what mode I'm showing up in with respect to any kind of conflict, whether that's a decision, whether that's a debate, or a full on disagreement of not just point of view, but of process and leadership with a board or with a co-executive or whatever that is. And so I fully agree. I think the sort of savior complex of our sector, that type of martyrdom syndrome is starting to wear off. There were a lot of executives and founders that looked up, sort of lifted their gaze and realized that nobody wanted their jobs because they had put so much into that at the sacrifice of their health and well-being and so many other areas of their life that nobody was standing in line for that baton. And so that old guard kind of mentality is shifting. I've seen that in the last 20 years. But what's now coming up is like, how do you do this and not burn out? How do you do this and lean in? And some of that is around how are you bringing your whole self to work around conflict, around engagement, around codependency, and check your ego constantly.
Oh, that's yes. First of all, I just want to say yes. And all of these stories are popping up in my brain of dear friends that I have who still work in the nonprofit field or my own experiences in the nonprofit field. And there's so many stories, right? Where it's like, time to leave, you're exhausted, you've done a whole day of work. And then, somebody comes in and they need something. And if they don't get that thing, something bad is going to happen to a human. So of course you stay. But it's like, if you don't set up the structures and the systems in place so that you can have a healthy culture where you don't burn out, like it's just going to continue. So I know one of the things that you do, which I find really interesting, is you go in and you serve as an interim executive for these organizations that things are, maybe they're falling apart. What I'll say is they need a change. They need a change. Is there a framework or a model that you use for these types of situations that are so rife with conflict and change?
Yeah, there are definitely. I think for us, we go into periods of inflection for change. That could be scale and growth. That could be doubling down on impact, and it could be a full-on turnaround. The framework that we lean on, and to my knowledge, it has not been adapted for organizational development, but I use it all the time for it. And if any of your listeners want more, I'm happy to share a deck that we've made. I should probably write something up, but we use the Miller and Rolnick framework around substance addiction. So William Miller and Stephen Rolnick did back in the 80s and 90s, they started looking at how is it that we can get substance addicted individuals to change their habits, change their behavior. And they came up with motivational interviewing. And motivational interviewing is widely practiced by therapists today. But when we talk about organizational change, organizations are made from people. It's about behavioral change at its core. And so we essentially use that framework to understand what stage of change is that organization in, and where is that showing up? What organizational stage of change is the board showing up as the executive bench, the senior leadership team, down to your staff. And so the first thing we do is really always is assess where people are at and find ways to align by lifting up. The motivational interviewing framework says that folks that are pre-contemplative, you always start with the lowest denominator of the organization or of that group. And pre-contemplation is the lowest denominator. And that is people don't think there's a problem to change, or they may think everything else is the problem, but not them. Nothing that they're doing is the problem. They're a victim of everybody else's problems, right? That type of mentality is what we call pre-contemplative. And the strategy for the intervention to move that person or that type of behavior was with high information and low intrusion. Low intrusion means we're not here to take your job. You're not necessarily getting fired tomorrow. You're not, right? How do you create safety so that people don't feel intruded upon? You enter with humility. You enter with a lot of listening, authentic relationship. And then high information is here's what a clear role for a case manager looks like. Here's what high performing sexual trafficking organizations look like. Here's what high performing, carceral justice organizations look like. And so you're sharing information that people can step into and begin to see a discrepancy between where they are today and what they could be. When they start to contemplate that, you have an invitation to then drive change in the organization. So we were very mindful about how we enter, extremely mindful about how we enter.
So can I just say, this is like a magic moment. I can't believe you actually use the stages of change model. I'm very familiar with the stages of change model, and watching folks move from pre-contemplation, going all the way to action, willpower, maintenance, because that is what we would use because I come from the behavioral healthcare field, and that is literally what we would use to bring somebody from the depths of despair in active addiction to recovery. And the fact that you use that now for organizations is so brilliant, is so fabulous. And it makes me think of this quote. Like at my old organization, we had this beautiful butterfly, and there was a quote across it, which is, what the caterpillar calls the end of the world, the master calls a butterfly. And when you are in, such a great quote about change, because when you are in pre-contemplation, moving into contemplate, it can feel like the end of the world. It feels like everything is falling apart in your organization, but there is something on the other side of it that is just completely transformed and waiting and available to you. And I know you've seen that time and time again.
Time and time again. And that's what I think is really beautiful about a change champion or someone who's guiding change, is that they have the perspective to see how organizations have made it on the other side and storytell backwards and say, listen, this could be you guys. You guys get to co-create this next chapter. Let's honor however we got to this moment is all in service of this opportunity for us. So how do we sort of rally for this next phase? I love the stages of change for your listeners. So motivational interviewing, as you know, is how you work through the stages of change. Prochaska, people Google Prochaska stages of change, which came out in the 70s, well before Miller and Rolnick. They'll be able to see the stage that you just mentioned that is now pictographed in like steps and lines and circles and all kinds of things. Yeah. But that's literally the reason I started applying that was I came from case management practice, working with juvenile justice young people. And that was a framework that I started using in my practice and teaching staff, and felt like, oh, I get how you help make change accessible. How do we do this in a bigger sandbox? How do we do this with systems? How do we do this with organizations? And it works. There's not a rote way, but the framework and the concept and how you think about architecting change works at all different sandboxes.
And what's so beautiful about that is, as you go in and you support the organization in essentially in recovering from the dysfunctional behaviors and systems, I think the people within that organization also heal themselves. They either heal or they leave, because once they're in a healthy new family, right, a healthy new system, there's no space for them anymore unless they also do that work.
Totally. I mean, clarity forces action, right? And I think we have to, when we go in, we have to normalize that not everybody's interested in doing that work. And that is okay, actually. It's not a judgment that you're not down enough, or you're not social justice enough, or you're not this enough. Wherever you are in control of what strategy and effort you need to deploy in what domains of your life. And so if this no longer aligns because the organization has clarity, let's align people to their highest and best use and get this bus loaded for the journey that this mission needs, right? What's central to our work and central to any change initiative is the intention, which I know is really important to you in your practice, Tanya, but maintaining your intention as the true north is what grounds the authenticity of the alignment and prevents people from feeling like all this is in service of, moving this type of people out or this type of people in. It's really about what is it that's going to serve the mission. So for us, we can have the best relationships with the person who brought us in. And guess what? In face of the mission, everybody is dispensable. Even the boss that brought us in, the CEO, the board chair, nobody is above the mission. That's who our loyalty is. Even if the funder paid for us, we're really about the mission. And that helps us stay very grounded and intentional around what types and earn the trust of the staff and of leadership to play and do whatever we need to do.
Hey, if anything you're hearing today inspires you to get more visible as a go-to trusted voice for your audience and drive change towards your deeper mission, I've got something for you. LinkedIn is my favorite place to share my stories and build relationships with my co-conspirators and brand new friends. So I put together a free resource with 14 prompts to create your next post on LinkedIn. Take all the guesswork out of what to say and just start building your impact and influence. Be sure to tag me in your post so I can come by, cheer you on, and amplify your message.
You can find those free prompts in the show notes. Okay, back to the episode. I want to shift a little bit. I love how you speak about this one particular mission of yours, which is through venture leadership, but you also have other activations of your vision or your mission. And so I want to know a little bit about how you show up as as a personal change maker, as a thought leader. And I know one of the ways you do that is Clubhouse, because I know that's how you met John and Becky. And I don't know how you and I never met.
Indirectly you. I think it was through all these Clubhouse contacts.
I know. You and I don't think ever actually ended up in a room together, but I don't think that you and I would know each other if it wasn't for Clubhouse. So it's just amazing how relationships get forged in this new kind of super digital age. But how do you use tools like Clubhouse for your own thought leadership?
I'm so glad that you and I are going to get to talk about this because it'll help. Maybe we can riff and crystallize our learning. So Clubhouse. So my value set is around building community. Some people, my husband's value set is around working out. If he has extra time, he's going to go work out. He's going to go do other. Mine is going to be to look for ways to build community. Ironically, as a semi-introvert. So I'm not right. Me building community isn't attending a ton of parties. It's going to be around finding ways to connect or deeply see people or be seen by people. And so during the pandemic was when Clubhouse, if you remember, had its little invitation only. And I was curious about it. I had a friend who had a lot of energy around hosting fundraising conversations on Clubhouse. And I don't pitch myself particularly as a fundraiser, but it's certainly one of the domains of leadership. So I said, okay, I'll join. And I started putzing around on Clubhouse and seeing that it was all about what I saw in my feed was NFTs, which I don't yet still understand, dating. There was 5 different things. And I was like, oh my gosh, where are my nonprofit people at? Where's the community at? And I couldn't really find those kinds of things. And so I started a nonprofit club. If any of you are in Clubhouse, there's several, I think couple of clubs that are all great. And just trying to sort of hoard and corral the sectors people into a space. And like a lot of these activations, I find I'm someone who loves ritual. And so I typically find something that will be a pace for me to engage. And so I'm not the person that goes totally gung-ho necessarily, because I know myself well enough to know that if I'm going to sprint, I have to rest. So is this a sprinting kind of thing, or is this something you want to try out? So I had committed to twice a week being on Clubhouse, once with this friend's room, and then once on this Clubhouse club that I was going to see if the community wanted to pick up. And now to this day, I still do at least once a month on Fridays in that Clubhouse room. And what I discovered, I did it for a year. I did it weekly for 1 year, 1.5 years actually. And I started coming out saying, oh my God, Clubhouse is the best life coach. It's a free life coach, because I learned so much about myself in doing Clubhouse that I would love to lift up and riff, but you have to pay attention. And so just to your question, I think for me, everything I do, because it costs me something. It costs me something in my family to step out for an hour. It costs me something in my other relationships, maybe costs me a less hour of sleep. I'm very aware of the cost. And so if I'm doing something, I'm looking for a deeper intention or a deeper meaning. And if I'm finding myself getting frustrated or it's not bringing me immediate joy, usually before I dismiss it, I will try to ask myself what that's about. And hence Clubhouse as a life coach, I'm like, oh, wow, there's a lot of things that are triggering me right now that I need to better explore. So let me pause. I'll pause there and see if you have any kinship there.
I have a lot of kinship. I think the repetition and the consistency is a huge skill set that is very important for thought leadership. And I think that's sometimes the missing piece, right? People are like, oh, well, I have all these things I want to say. And then it's hard. It's hard to stay consistent. That's why diets fail. That's why I think consistency and being able to form habits is one of the greatest predictor for success out more than anything else. And I think that's why Atomic Habits was such a big hit. And so I think, yes, that consistency piece is huge. The other piece for me, if I were to answer this question, because, I dabbled with Clubhouse too, is I think that it gave me a playground to practice what community building could look like in terms of a new vision for the world that didn't quite exist yet. And let me explain that. So a few weeks ago, I interviewed Lola Bakary for this podcast. And she started a Clubhouse group called Professional Women of Color. And I found it really early. And I, kept showing up every Tuesday. Again, repetition and consistency, because I needed it. The group was where we would share one scary thing that we did the last week. And I kept showing up because I felt like I needed it. And perhaps somebody else might need what I had to say in that space. And after a while, someone assigned me as a moderator. Like I had that check mark or whatever denotes that. I forget that you're a mod. And then all of a sudden I was invited to this internal Slack leadership group for the thing. And I guess what I'm trying to say is, without having to wrestle my way in or prove my worth or like lobby for my space, I was just a leader in the group. Like they saw my contribution and made me a leader. And I think in the world, we see a lot of kind of high profile cases, like Ketanji Brown Jackson comes to mind, where we have to keep proving our worth, to the point of hurt, to the point where it doesn't even make sense, to the point where it's not reasonable. But in this growing community on Clubhouse, I just kind of belonged because I showed up and that was enough. And so I think that these spaces like Clubhouse or whatever is going to come out next, these different places where we get to practice thought leadership and being visible, I think helps us create a vision that doesn't yet exist. And then we can bring what we've learned into our spaces, our workplaces, our organizations, our clubs, our teams, because we get to practice elsewhere. Yeah.
No, I think that's really well said. And I think the notion of how, like in your story, I hear you feeling really seen as you became a moderator and as you became looped into that, right? And so when you talk about building community in the virtual world or in the physical world, or I guess 3D world versus, 0D or 2D world, it is about being seen authentically. And it's interesting what those proxies were. And for me, my journey was, there was a couple things that were fascinating. One was I got very quickly frustrated by not being able to have a physical cue to tell people that I was trying to see them, right? So that in Zoom, I'm constantly doing thumbs up, and on it, visually I'm going, and that's not appropriate in Clubhouse. You mute yourself when you're done, when you're not speaking. And before, months later was when the little mute on and off flash started happening as a clap.
Yes.
But before that, there was not really this culture of clapping or being seen. And the Clubhouse as a life coach question to me was like, whoa, what's that about? Like the person is actually just fine. The person is speaking their truth and has the mic. Why do you, Aila, need that person to see that you're validating them, right? Like what is that about? That's my own self-validation, that I want to feel good about contributing to somebody else's being seen. So Clubhouse immediately began to help me question like how I was showing up in spaces and who that showing up was actually for, which was really fascinating. I think the second question or sort of trigger that I had was that I would go into some rooms where, being a moderator and holding space in any world, in any dimensional world, takes intention, takes a lot of thought and practice and being present. And it's certainly true in Clubhouse when you're the moderator. I don't moderate rooms and walk around like I am sitting and I'm taking notes. Like I am really holding that space, even though participants may be doing multitasking things. And I want people to feel like they can come in and out of that space safely and to what meets their needs. But in holding that space and curating that space, it takes some intention and time. And a trigger for me was I, as a participant, was seeing some moderators really let people speak on and on and on. And I found myself getting really frustrated. And after I got frustrated, I realized like, wow, there's so much beauty in the fact that this moderator is not trying to cut the person off and is not thinking of the rest of the room necessarily, but is actually really focused on letting that person go. And so I started to then ask myself, how much do I control in settings and in conversations and around spaces? How much can I let go and really listen and not be so impatient about getting to the punchline or getting to the action or just letting people be? that was a really beautiful lesson. And it took me, a couple things. Let me just lift up two more and then I'll kick it back to you. The other one for me was around back to validation was when I was holding rooms, I found myself, there's a feature where you're holding a room. So our room was sort of like bring a quote, an intention. It's a riff. It was an open riff on Fridays for practitioners. And I found myself initially trying to hold space, and you can ping people in to the room. And I wouldn't do a lot of pregame of like, hey, everybody join. A lot of folks that were holding rooms that were very, very successful had done a lot of pregame beforehand. Mine was just a container. And there were some days where there were like 3 attendees and some days where there were 20 attendees. And so getting off of that call and feeling like being very active in dismissing a metric of success or failure based upon number of attendees and participants was another life teaching moment where I had that moment of like, I'm doing this to build community. I'm doing this to feed myself. I'm doing this to provide a space for other people to feed themselves. That one, that's going to ebb and flow, and not every conversation is going to feel totally bucket filling. And 2, your measure of success to that intention is not necessarily how many people showed up. And if that was the measure of success, then why aren't you pinging people in, right? So there was a very interesting, like I had to hold myself accountable to the intention and what was happening and my feelings. So I'll stop, but my hats are off to Clubhouse. And if you stay awake during anything that you do, I think you can have real life coaching possibilities.
Oh my gosh. I mean, I just had so many aha moments as you were talking, from the piece around wanting to validate people as they're speaking, which by the way, I have to just name that tapping the mute on and off of the applause as such a white rice as a glue stick moment, like, because we didn't have the tools, right?
Totally.
To be able to but we figured it out. We were resourceful. We were like, let's just do this. The piece around being in an open riff room, that was a huge life coach thing for me too, because I always have felt like every blank space in a conversation has to be filled. But no, you can sit quietly and just wait for the next comment to emerge. And for me, one of the things that came up for me as you were sharing just now was how much I didn't necessarily need to validate other people, but my big thing is I didn't want to interrupt. So in these open riff rooms, when it was kind of like not popcorn style, but you just whoever was next went, I never went because I was so afraid of interrupting or starting to talk at the same time as someone else. And it's all these things that we realize that, if we accidentally interrupt someone, it's really not a big deal. It's all good. It's fine. And so again, it's a place to practice a different way of being where maybe the stakes are not so high and figure out how to live maybe without urgency too. Because the urgency is a big thing that I hear in what you've said and what I'm thinking too. It's a way to practice living without urgency.
Yeah. And I think it's practicing living without control, I would say. I don't know, urgency, control are double sides of the same coin, but sort of this or same side of a coin. But I think there's this notion of when you let go of something and you just participate and you witness, some really beautiful things can happen, either discomfort in which you can have a moment of introspection or joy. And there's something that you discovered that you did not architect or construct, right? And I also found myself, when you did go for the mic in those riff rooms, so when I wasn't a moderator and if I went for the mic in the riff room, I would often speak top of mind and then get off I'm Aila and I'm done speaking and have this moment of, oh shit, did that even make any sense? Have this second guessing of myself because now the moment is gone. And I am because I want to be not a mic hog and be able to pass the mic around, that comment may or may not get picked up on. It may or may not feel complete to me. And I don't really have a chance to recomplete it. It's not necessarily my space. And so that was also an interesting learning. Okay, maybe it made sense. Maybe it didn't make sense. Did I feel good contributing it? If I didn't, think about that. What was the need to reach for that mic if you didn't feel like you had your thoughts all dialed down? On the other hand, great that you went with your gut. Maybe someone was meant to hear that comment, right? So it was an interesting mind. The Clubhouse for me was not just building community outwardly, but building community with myself because I was having so much internal chatter in both good and bad ways, which was fascinating.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's definitely a way to self-grow, self-actualize, all of those kinds of things. I could talk to you about this for another hour, but
Me
I
too.
know, and maybe we will. Maybe part two is to come. But in these last couple of moments, I have two more questions that I would love to ask you that I ask everyone. One is easy, one is maybe not. This is the not so easy one. Or maybe it's easy for you. Anyway, what is your big dreamy vision for the future?
Yeah, this is not so easy for me. You did give me a preview that you'd be asking this question, and this was the question I sat on for a while. My personal big dreamy vision is to write a book. I've written some children's books as side hobbies, but I want to really actually write a book about my mom and being a first generation Pakistani American. And I guess memoir meets like mental health, meets glass castle, meets a bunch of things. And I want to live on a farm and I want to travel a whole bunch. Those are sort of my personal ones. I think for me, the next 5 or 6 years is really around the nonprofit community. And I'm not talking about nonprofit complex industry. I'm talking about nonprofit community of practitioners is a growing community in the country. And we are now called upon nationally, internationally to solve some of the world's toughest issues. And so for me, there's a calling around how do we get very intentional about garnering the empathy and resources that are needed to solve the world's most pressing issues. For me, that comes down to really doing that inner work in a micro, macro level. So how are we using all of the experiences that we're doing in the community to build ourselves such that we can be more empathetic and connect people to causes that I do believe we can solve. But I think that requires being comfortable with conflict. It requires doing our own work. So for me, the next couple of years is about that connective tissue and about advancing our voice as a sector in the national arena, and then figuring out if there's an international play from there. I'm really called to that part of the work.
Well, I love it because as we said before, there's like this fractal piece of it where like when you heal yourself, you're able to be such a more of an effective change maker outwards. And then also as the systems change and the organizations change, those within the organization also shift. So it's like an inner and an outer. I totally agree.
It's like an organism, right? And and the organism can be at the micro level and then the organizational level and then the system level. And I've had fun playing at each of those levels. And I'm really feeling called to sort of the next big sandbox, which is how do we do that as a country? We have a lot of diverse thoughts. We have a lot of diverse pain and experiences, power structures. Like how do we do that in a way where it's not dominated by just the polarized extremes of polarized left, polarized right? Like how do we actually bring community empathy to the center of our work as a country and as an international community, as a planet? So that's the sandbox I want to try. We want to try motivational interviewing in that sandbox. What does that look like? What conversations have to be had? What kind of fights have to be had? What tears? What reparation, reconciliation? Like that's what my vision. I want to be intentional about spending time in that place.
Yeah, 1,000%. Well, I'll be right there with you if you allow me to be.
Yes.
I'm just going to be following you around.
Please. Yes. Let's do it.
Let's do it. So how can people find you and get in touch with you?
I'm in a lot of I'm not so great at Twitter, though I have a Twitter handle account. I hang out on LinkedIn and Instagram. My Instagram is Aila Malik author. And then I have a family travel account that's my love, which is we were the Franklin Street Globetrotters. We traveled for a year. And then I'm on LinkedIn. Those are the social platforms. The easiest way to stay connected, and I would love to, is I have a website that forced me to put all my activations on one page. And it's my name, ailamalik.com. And those have all the links to all the different things. But I would really love to lift. I came here because I leaned on the backs of a lot of folks and connections to be that rice to glue stick kind of way of getting here to wherever that is, to having a sandbox to play in. And I'm more than happy to do that for colleagues out in the space that are trying to figure out what's next for them. So stay in touch.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful and so appreciated. I'm so grateful to have had this time with you. And I can't wait for more conversations. You and I are going to spend a whole day together in August and can't wait to see what comes out of that.
And I love just on that. I mean, to end on the fact that like you and I never met. We met because of connection to connection out through, I don't know, probably Clubhouse kind of things. Then we had a Zoom meeting to just introduce ourselves, had this kind of authentic connection to, I think this is probably the second Zoom podcast thing that I'm sharing with you. And then you're going to come to my house in August. Like, I love that there's a lean in that went from like no sort of physical presence to 2D to now all the way 3D. And I cannot wait. And so I think, how do we do that with folks? And if you're listening to this podcast, like, you should reach out to folks, because that's how we begin to create community that is going to be activating the next solutions that we desperately, desperately need in all areas of our existence.
That's right. It all comes down to relationship at the end of the day, and trust.
Yep.
And that's it.
And you can't do relationship and trust until you're simultaneously also understanding and what's getting in the way for yourself to be authentically expressed, right? So it's just a full loop.
That's
personal,
it.
Relational, personal, relational.
That's it. Because the most important relationship that you'll ever have is with yourself. And if that doesn't exist, you really can't build relationship externally. It's impossible.
Double click.
Double click.
Double click, snap, thumbs up, validation.
I love you so much. This was such an amazing chat. Thank you for this time. I appreciate you.
Appreciate you too. Talk to you soon. Let me know any next steps. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Take care. Bye-bye.
What'd you think? Leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, or even better, reach out and let me know through lumosmarketing.co. Yes, that's Lumos, as in the illumination spell from Harry Potter. Because when you shine, magical things happen. You can get social with me on LinkedIn, and of course, check out the show notes to stay in touch with our guests. Let's talk soon.